Life is full of choices, from simple ones to ones that are much more complex. Choices like, well, what am I going to eat for dinner? And do I cook or do I go out? And if I go out, do I eat something healthy or do I eat something that's modeled after food you might find at the fair? Choices. Do I take the scenic route? Or do I take the most direct route? Do I fight through traffic or do I look for an alternate route? Choices. What brand should I buy? And what option should I include? What color am I going to paint the house? And what shade of that color am I going to use? Choices. What college do I choose? Do I take this job or do I stay at this one? What career path do I follow? What do I do with this relationship? What plan of care do I take for this particular health issue that I'm having? Do I choose this one or this other one? Those choices, well, they're a little more complicated, but still choices. So, how do you make choices? How do you make choices like that and really any choices that you face? Do you choose the easiest path? Do you choose the path that's the most fun? Do you choose the path that feels good at the moment? Or do you consider not just the present, but the long-term implications of your choices and your decisions? Do you ask yourself, what's the right way? What's the wisest way? What's the best path? Sometimes the easiest way and the right way or the wise way are one and the same, but not always. So how do you know what the right way to go is? The Bible. The Bible does give direction. The Bible helps you determine what's right, what's best, what does God want you to do, and is what looks good actually good from God's perspective? And maybe you've read a bunch of Bible in your life. That's good. But you still need to choose what you're going to do with all that Bible teaching that you've read. And that's what Jesus gets into here in this last section as he closes down these 3 chapters of this message that we commonly call the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus asks you to think about, what are you going to do with what Jesus has said? And what choices will you make about the teaching that he's just shared? And how will you know what's the wise thing to do and what's the best course to follow? Jesus gives 3 illustrations to make his point. Let's look at them one at a time. I'm reading from Matthew chapter 7, beginning at verse 13. Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." So the picture is before you is this wide gate or this wide path or the narrow gate and the narrow path. And Jesus says, which one do you choose? Now, Jesus has repeatedly made the point in the Sermon on the Mount that God's way is the narrow way. But that doesn't mean that it's exclusive, by the way. Actually, this narrow way, God's way, is the most inclusive of all. I'm saying that because there's no prerequisites for getting on God's path. I mean, everyone's invited to follow it, no matter who they are, no matter how they speak, no matter what they look like, no matter what they've done. And there's nothing that you have to do before you can start to walk on God's way. There are no prerequisites to fulfill before you walk on God's path. God actually comes to you and offers you this gracious invitation to receive what he gives freely, and again, regardless of your condition, which sounds pretty inclusive to me, and it is. But when you walk God's path, when you receive that invitation, when you receive what he gives you by grace, you do find that the path you're on is a narrow way. It's a narrow way because God's perspectives, things like Jesus has talked about, like humbleness of heart and poverty of spirit, well, they aren't easy for people to embrace. And God's values, things like authenticity and generosity that Jesus has talked about, they're not easy to make our own. And the characteristics of a Christ follower, like that balance between grace and truth and mercy and judgment that Jesus talked about here, that can be challenging to live out consistently, right? And I think a large part of that is because God's way, this narrow way, is different from the way that our natural self is pulling. It's different from the way our natural self wants to go. It's different from the way that the crowd is heading, which means that God's way, this narrow way, it simply can't be pursued as long as you're motivated by a desire to conform with the crowd or with culture. I mean, the narrow way, God's way, is not the easy way. But it is the right way. It is the best way. The best way not only for making our relationships work, but for growing closer to God and for showing other people what God is like and how life with God is ultimately better than life without him. I really like how the Message paraphrases it. Let me read it to you. Don't look for shortcuts to God. The market is flooded with surefire, easygoing formulas for a successful life that can be practiced in your spare time. Don't fall for that stuff, even though crowds of people do. The way to life, to God, is vigorous and requires total attention. Now, as you reflect on that, before we move on in this conversation, I want you to stop and think about how that applies to your own life. Right? Where are you tempted to take shortcuts in your relationship with God? And what's one change then that you can make in your life to give your relationship with God the attention that it requires? Hit pause and stop and spend a few minutes thinking and talking about that right now. So say you've listened to Jesus. Say you've chosen God's way and you're walking on that narrow way that leads to life, and you're working at giving your relationship with God the attention that it deserves. That's all good. But then how do you keep on that road? Now that too is going to require some wisdom and some discernment. Not just because you're getting mixed messages from culture, but also because you might be getting some mixed messages from people who say that they're on the same road with you, on that same narrow road. That's the next illustration, the next section that Jesus gives us in Matthew chapter 7, beginning at verse 15. Listen.
Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.
So here's what I think Jesus is saying there. I think Jesus is saying that not everything that sounds good actually is good. And I think Jesus is saying not everybody who talks about me is really leading you to me. So you need to be wise and discerning in who you listen to and who you follow. I think that's more important today, really, than it's ever been. And that's because today you have access electronically to more Bible and to more Bible teaching than ever before. And all sorts of really gifted and talented speakers and scholars, and they're available, a lot of them for free, at your own pace and your own schedule. And you know, that's really good. It can really help you in your walk with God. There's a lot of content out there that can help you grow in your walk with God and give it the attention that it deserves. But there's also a lot out there from some really talented speakers, again, that's not as good or as godly as it first appears. So again, the question is, how do you discern what's good and what's not? How do you discern what's right and what's wrong? What's of God and what only appears to be? Well, here's what I think. It's about substance, not style. Right? It's about substance, not style. I mean, what you ask yourself is what they're teaching, does it match with what Jesus was teaching? And does how they're living match with what Jesus is saying? And do their attitudes align with what Jesus is advocating? I mean, and actually the best way to see that is if you're actually in some sort of a relationship with someone, which is why even if you're getting most of your Bible information electronically, I want to encourage you to find a local church. Right? Find a local church and have a connection with some in-person, in-the-flesh pastor. Because when you do, you can actually see in that relationship if the messenger and Jesus' message kind of match up and align, and if the preacher is actually leading you on the narrow road or a different one. See, when you have personal contact with a preacher, then you can see things like, well, you can get some sense of the preacher's heart. And you can see if they actually show humility. And you can observe if mercy actually triumphs over judgment most of the time in their lives. And you can notice if their lives demonstrate some of the perspectives and values and character that Jesus has been talking about here. Are they authentic? Are they generous? Is their message about Jesus and not themselves? Again, I think the Message has a really good take on that. Let me read it to you. Be wary of false preachers who smile a lot, dripping with practiced sincerity. Chances are they're out to rip you off some way or other. Don't be impressed with charisma. Look for character. Who preachers are is the main thing, not what they say. A genuine leader will never exploit your emotions or your pocketbook. These diseased trees with their bad apples are going to be chopped down and burned. Knowing the correct password, saying Master, Master, for instance, isn't going to get you anywhere with me. What is required is serious obedience, doing what my Father wills. Which brings us, I think, to Jesus' final point here as he's wrapping up his message and talking about discernment and wisdom. Jesus' point here is that God's will isn't simply to be admired or discussed or talked about or debated or praised. It's to be done. Check it out. Matthew chapter 7, beginning at verse 24.
Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash.
In Jesus' story here, why does the house stand or fall? It's not the building materials. It's the foundation. And I confirmed that with my son, the structural engineer. You can build something out of the best and most expensive and costly materials, but if the foundation is bad or weak, well, then when a storm comes, you're really in trouble, and a crash is almost inevitable. And I think that's what Jesus is pointing out here about our faith life as he wraps things up and summarizes his message. Two things, in fact, I think he's pointing out about the foundation. First of all, Jesus is pointing out that ultimately, he himself, ultimately Jesus is our rock-solid foundation, the only one. And building on anything else leave you destined for a crash. What did Jesus tell his disciples, John 14? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus is that sure, rock-solid, certain foundation to build on, the one that will not collapse, the one that'll stand through any storm. But I think here Jesus is also saying at this conclusion that the foundation is rock-solid when you actually, when you work these words of Jesus into your life. When you work these words of Jesus into your life and work at doing what they say. Did you notice in the story that both the wise and the foolish builder heard the words of Jesus? Yeah. They both heard the words of Jesus. Perhaps they both studied, even memorized the words of Jesus. Perhaps they even delighted in the words of Jesus. And that's all good. But here's the important difference that Jesus is pointing out. The difference is that the wise person both heard the words of Jesus and worked at putting them into practice. While the foolish builder heard those same words of Jesus and then keeps doing whatever he wants. And I think that's one of the places that Satan is at his sneakiest, especially in teaching churches. I mean, what he does is he gets us to focus on learning and learning and learning more Bible and talking and talking and talking more Bible and discussing and discussing and discussing more Bible and tweeting and retweeting and tweeting more Bible and then doing some more of that, right? Because more listening and discussing and talking and learning and memorizing is good, right? More should be better. As if the mere act of reading and listening was what Jesus was after, and applying what we've heard in our lives or changing our behavior to reflect Jesus' teaching, that's just, well, kind of optional. I mean, I think Satan's mostly okay with us just listening and reading and listening some more. Not totally okay because he doesn't like the word at all. But I think he knows if we're just listening and talking and studying and never working at doing, I think he's okay with that. And if Satan's okay with something, we should not be. If Satan's okay with us just listening to the exclusion of working at doing, that we shouldn't be okay with that. See, listening without doing is not what Jesus was after when he took the time to give this message. All right, Jesus wants us to read and study and memorize his word, absolutely. All right, but Jesus also wants us to work his word into our lives and to work at doing what he's been teaching. You see, the process isn't the point. The place where the path takes you is the point, both in this life and the life to come. Once more, I think the Message paraphrase puts it really well. Listen. These words I speak to you are not incidental additions to your life, homeowner improvements to your standard of living. They are foundational words, words to build a life on. If you work these words into your life, you are like a smart carpenter who built his house on solid rock. Rain poured down, the river flooded, a tornado hit, but nothing moved that house. It was fixed to the rock. But if you just use my words in Bible studies and don't work them into your life, you are like a stupid carpenter who built his house on the sandy beach. When the storm rolled in and the waves came up, it collapsed like a house of cards. I'm thinking maybe the last few years have brought that point into maybe a little bit clearer focus. And maybe because of all that's happened, you're starting to see the importance of building on solid ground. Building on solid ground. Building on Jesus. Building on Jesus and putting his words into practice in your life. That's a wise choice. Not the easiest choice. It is a narrow road after all, but the wisest choice and the best one. I mean, here's what I found after years of trying to do this and pursue this path, that when you're building on Jesus and when you're working at putting his words actually into practice in your life, and when you're working at developing those perspectives and values and character that he's talking about here in this Sermon on the Mount, that you're actually better able to handle the storms of life that are inevitably going to come. You also find yourself, that you find both grace and peace growing in your life, even in faith-stretching situations. I've also found that when you do that, your relationships with others, actually tend to work better. And your relationship with God grows stronger. And I found that you're better able to help others through their own storms, and also you're able to give them a much better picture of what Jesus is like. At least, that's what I found. And I think if you give Jesus away a chance, if you both hear his word and work at putting it into practice, I think you'll find that the same thing rings true for you.